On 25th of April 1915, Anzac forces landed on the beach at Gallipoli for what would become one of the bloodiest and most ill-considered campaigns of World War I. Tending the sick and wounded was a 26-year-old doctor, Captain Frank Harvey, an Irish-born general practitioner from Napier. Frank survived the carnage of Gallipoli and went on to see even more human suffering on the Western Front. His war experience, and then the influenza pandemic which ravaged New Zealand on his return home in 1918, would see him become the driving force behind the foundation of MAS.
So Gallipoli was an 8-month-long campaign that took them through blazingly hot summer, a freezing winter. Like all of the New Zealand soldiers who were there, the doctors were on the peninsula. They were bombarded with them. They ate the rations they ate. They probably suffered from the dysentery. They probably experienced malnutrition like soldiers did as well. Things that had to happen at a field hospital on Gallipoli would have been treating rifle wounds, artillery wounds, shell blast wounds, but also a lot of caring for men with disease. And for someone like Frank, he would have trained as basically a family doctor. Childhood illnesses, a little bit of basic surgery, dealing with accidents, and infections. Of course, we're about nearly 10 years short of the discovery of penicillin, so there were no antibiotics.
The medical experience of the war and then the influenza pandemic which ravaged New Zealand as the soldiers returned home in 1918 shaped a generation of New Zealand doctors. One of them, Frank Harvey, would soon go on to become the driving force behind the foundation of MAS.
The influenza pandemic, I think it's very hard for us to imagine how that must have, in a way, re-traumatised or doubled down on the trauma that a society and a culture was already experiencing. By the armistice in November of 1918, about 18,000 New Zealand men had been killed. Then the pandemic was exacerbated by the armistice celebrations, people going out, congregating together, and it was a specific kind of influenza. The very young and the very old tended to be spared, and it was that group in the middle of able-bodied younger adults who were struck down by it. For someone who'd come from war, where at least there was a reason, there was duty, and while it might not have been glorious and noble as people had hoped it would be, there was at least some consolation in deaths being worth something. But you could see that perhaps the flu just felt random and cruel, and even for doctors that must have been extremely difficult to handle.
The trauma of World War I and the flu pandemic had lasting impacts on New Zealand's society in peacetime. As New Zealanders looked to rebuild in the 1920s, improving public health was a major priority.
It's interesting that some of the key things that we now take for granted around health, so the school dental service, for example, the Plunkett system of infant welfare, they're two initiatives born out of the war and a concern for the health of young women as the mothers of children, and the concerns around infant welfare, around the growth of children, how could they be looked after better.
For most occupation groups, it wasn't possible to get insurance that covered personal injury and accident before the war. But the soldiers of World War I had seen something quite different when they joined the army.
The army, it insured everybody effectively. That in volunteering, in signing up, in enlisting for the army, in a way you entered into a bargain with the state. They paid you for your work or your service, but they also guaranteed that if something were to happen to you, if you were wounded or if you died, they would take care of you. If you died, they would bury you and they would take care of your family. So, we see a lot of men who didn't have to join up, so men who were in protected industries, for example, so mining is a good example, forestry. They didn't have to join up, but they chose to because their jobs were dangerous. And a lot of men reasoned, well, my work's just as dangerous as going to war, but if I go to war and something happens to me, the army will take care of my mother, or the army will take care of my wife. And so the sense that the army would provide, I suspect, was part of what Frank was observing, and that perhaps when he came back he decided that, again, this model of who will provide for us as independent businessmen, which doctors were, who would provide for us if something happened to us and we could no longer earn. And so I wonder whether it was exposure to a different kind of institution and a different kind of model that perhaps spurred him to do that.
In August 1921, Dr. Frank Harvey gathered 6 colleagues in the sitting room of his Napier home, and they formed the Medical Assurance Society.
Dr. Frank Harvey was the key person behind the establishment of MAS. He was a family doctor, and during the war developed an interest in radiology. So I think for the first time, really, he was starting to think about the idea that his colleagues, this group of health professionals in New Zealand, could really benefit from establishing an insurance business for the benefit of the members, and then ultimately through that a better level of healthcare for the country.
By the end of the first year, MAS had 200 members, and through the 1920s, the membership steadily grew stronger, as did the sense among members that they were lucky to be part of MAS and that they should protect it if necessary.
So in 1934, the directors proposed a merger with a commercial insurance company, Fame, and put it to the membership. The response from the members was overwhelmingly opposed to that proposal. Fame, in the end, actually decided to withdraw. It occurred to them that they wouldn't be able to secure the level of ongoing business that they'd hoped to if it was to be successful. Even though only 13 years old, it was pretty clear that the membership were determined to essentially control their own destiny. They wanted to be a mutual.
Part of it is that, to begin with at least, it had a narrow but deep focus. So even now, over 90% of all doctors belong to MAS. And that, to a large extent, reflects the mutuality, the cooperative nature, and a little bit at least historically, the elitist nature of that organisation, that you were a doctor so you could belong. And so it was very much a boys' club, but it did have a mutually beneficial reason for existing, and that has really continued through the decades since it's been in existence. So I think that helped establish and give it an incredibly deep and lasting basis on which to grow. And it's never lost that, even though it has extended its membership, and now, as you may well know, it's now extended to all professionals. But that doesn't detract from its beginning. It has a deep, deep root that I think would be really hard to extinguish now, which is why you can extend the membership and not lose what we have had for the last 100 years.